All right, what's up, everybody? So I've been having issues with Vimeo and trying to figure it out. I think I've got it this time. We'll roll the clip and see what we got. Um, I'm having to redo two of these again, the 7 Years War and taxation and smuggling, because of these issues. I had uploaded two of them, but they didn't have audio because Vimeo um, has a small little thing right before you click to go that says something about connecting your audio, and I didn't see that those two times. This time I saw it. Then I had issues with it crashing, the my camera crashing for some reason in middle of the video. So let's go and hope there's no hiccups this time. All right, John Green, what you got for us today?
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to discuss the events that led to the American Revolution. So we'll begin with the 7 Years' War, which, as Crash Course World History fans will remember, Winston Churchill referred to as the First World War. The Americans called it the French and Indian War. The Prussians called it the Third Silesian.
Maybe he'll mention this, but the reason why it's called the First World War is because it was fought in Asia, Africa, North America, the Caribbean, Europe, and maybe South America somewhere. I can't remember. But of course, India, there were large battles. Europe, large battles. North America, large battles. But in Africa, it was one small battle. I can't even remember. It may have been a taking of a fort in Africa, or it may have been a ship battle off the coast of Africa. I can't remember right now, but something like that. It wasn't that big of a, that big of a thing. But then in the Caribbean, of course, there was a lot of fighting going on, especially among ships.
War. Swedes called it the Pomeranian War. For today, we're just going to call it the 7 Years' War on account of how it lasted for 9 years. So here at Crash Course, we take a broad view of history, and rather than
Perhaps they called it the 7 Years' War because um, in Europe, maybe it lasted 7 years. Maybe they didn't count two of the 7 years. Perhaps General Braddock's march to Fort Duquesne wasn't counted by Europeans. So perhaps somewhere there is the 9 extra years. I didn't really see the dates there real clear. But anyway,
than talking about the minute details of wars, we try to focus on the important stuff. Causes, effects, anytime Vladimir Putin might show up, and teacup kittens. And as far as causes go, the 7 Years' War was really, like most wars, about economics. Mr. Green, is this economics class? Because I don't remember signing up for it. Yeah, this is economics class, me from the past. It's economics and religion and psychology and anthropology and astronomy and physics and ecology and literature. That's the great thing about history. You can't put the past into little boxes that you study for 50 minutes a day until the bell rings. You can't separate what happened from what people wanted and believed and valued. Right, so mercantilism was the key economic theory of the British Empire in the 18th century. Because while Adam Smith and David Ricardo were talking up free trade and economic liberalism by 1750, no one was really listening. Mercantilism was basically the idea that the government should regulate the economy in order to increase national power. This meant
Adam Smith may have been talking about it, but his book, The Wealth of Nations, didn't come out till like 1776. I believe that was the year it was published, was in 1776.
encouraging local production through tariffs and monopolies, and also trying to ensure a favorable balance of trade. And colonies were an awesome way to create this favorable trade balance because they both produced raw materials and bought back finished goods made from those raw materials. But for it to work, you always need more and more land, so you can have more raw materials and more colonists to buy finished goods. By the way, it's important to understand the centrality of slavery in this colonial.
He he's probably going to talk about it. Slavery. I don't know. I know that the war started between the French coming down through the Ohio Valley, trying to connect to um um not Baton Rouge, New Orleans. And so they were building a series of forts trying to connect Canada to New Orleans, cutting off expansion from the British into other territories. I don't know if it would have really helped. England really wasn't looking at that time to actually look, trying to stop the French. It all sparked between a dispute between Governor Dinwiddie, Virginia, and the French. And then it escalated from there. So I mean, he's gonna probably relate slavery to somewhere there. But um, so I don't. I mean, first it was a local thing, and then it blew up into something bigger. I'll put it like that.
Economy. I mean, the most important colonial trade goods were tobacco and sugar, and both of those crops relied heavily on slave labor. And slaves themselves were a key trade good in the so-called triangular trade between
Hmm.
Europe, Africa, and the colonies. As one historian put it, the growth and prosperity of the emerging society of free colonial British America were achieved as a result of slave labor. So Britain's greatest rival in the 18th century was France. Like, on paper, the Spanish had a more significant.
I don't agree that prosperity was just based on slavery. There were a lot of people who were becoming prosperous without slavery, who didn't have slaves. I think of my ancestors, they were prosperous because of the fur trade. People loved the fur trade, and there were no slaves between them selling furs. They sold furs directly to manufacturers or even to tradesmen who took it over to England and sold the furs there to manufacturers who would then make clothes out of them. And I don't believe the people making the clothes were slaves. Maybe somebody can prove me wrong about that, but in England there weren't as many slaves. Now in the south of the colonies and in the Caribbean there were a lot of slaves, and yes, sugar cane and things like that, but sugar cane and tobacco wasn't the be all end all of commerce. New England shipped a lot of wood back to England because England was building their navy. And a lot of that was not labor from slaves. A lot of that was labor from indentured servants, whether they were black or white, and free blacks and free whites. So I wouldn't, that's a theory that likes to be promulgated that all prosperity, they make it like all prosperity or even the majority of prosperity. No, slave plantation owners were a minority. Of all the working people in North America, slave owners were the real minority. Really, they were the minority. And yes, they built off their wealth from it, but it didn't benefit a lot of other people. Especially New England was not very as heavily into slavery, and there were um, a lot of other occupations besides plantation owners that created wealth. That's what I want to say. A lot of other things that created wealth besides plantations.
Empire in North America, and they'd certainly been there longer, but their empire was really sparsely populated. In fact, by 1800, Los Angeles, the most populous town in Spanish California, had a population of 300 and only 17 freeways. The French colonies were considerably more populous, but even so, by 1750, there were only about 65,000 French colonists, most of them in the St. Lawrence River Valley, thereabouts. I don't know, maybe it was somewhere over here. This isn't a terribly detailed.
Some of this is due to, for instance, when the Spanish came over, they didn't bring their wives, they didn't bring their children. They weren't coming to colonize, they came to loot mostly. And when I say loot, I mean loot. Like, come take as much gold and either settle there with a new woman while leaving their wife over there in Spain, and or getting as much gold and heading back to Spain to spend it there. Um, while and this was the same with the French. The French weren't really reliant on families either. A lot of them were single men who came over for the fur trapping business, stayed among the Indians, got wives, married Native Americans, and then were involved in the fur trade. That was a big thing. Yes, there were some colonists who brought their families, but it wasn't the majority. While the British colonies, they were mostly whole entire families leaving England, saying we're never going back, coming to the Americas, establishing their family here, and creating roots. Um, Sometimes they stole the land from the Indians. A lot of times, though, they bought the land from them. So some of the buying, you know, you could say was sketchy, but um, in any case, that was the main thing. That's why their populations grew a lot faster than Los Angeles or even the French, because it was mostly based on family units.
Detailed map, and also I'm not looking at it. But the French were moving into the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys and forming alliances with American Indians there to try to dominate the fur and deerskin trades, and that proved problematic. So wars usually have really complicated causes, and it's very rare that we can refer to one.
So that what he just said is true. There, they were trying to the French were more into establishing those communications with Native Americans. I actually am reading this book called Young Washington, and it goes into depth about how the Indians were more inclined to join the French than to join the British, because they saw the British as more intrusive, and they, in their point of view, the British were more intrusive than the French.
One thing is making them inevitable. Fortunately, the 7 Years' War is the exception to that rule. Dan, I think I just used the word exception, which means it's time for a Mongoltage. I guess they heard there was an exception in town. So in 1749, the governor of Virginia awarded a huge land grant to something called the Ohio Company, which was basically a real estate development firm designed to benefit the governor of Virginia's friends. The Native Americans and their French supporters thought this was bad form because they thought they had rights to the land. So the Ohio Company asked the French to recognize their land claims, and the French were like, no! Let's go to the thought bubble. The actual fighting began when the British, or more precisely British colonists, led by a 21-year-old militia colonel named George Washington, yes, that George Washington, tried to eject the French from the forts they were constructing in western Pennsylvania. The first attempt in 1754 was a disaster. Washington built and then abandoned the ironically named Fort Necessity with the loss of 1/3 of his men. It was followed by the equally unsuccessful attack on Fort Duquesne, now located in downtown Pittsburgh, where
So with Fort Necessity, George Washington's mistake was he didn't cut enough of the tree line, and so the French and Indians were able to use it as cover and take pot shots at his men who were left in an exposed position. And let me just correct: Fort Duquesne, later renamed Fort Pitt, is not in Pittsburgh anymore. There is a museum. There's a little hut that used to be a part of the fort, but the fort is not there anymore, sadly.
the French and Indians pounded the British, killing 2/3 of General Braddock's forces and also General Braddock. Things didn't go much better for the British for the next 2 years, although they did take control of part of Nova Scotia and kick out more than 11,000 French Acadians, many of whom died in what is called the Expulsion. Some of those who didn't.
That's where the poem Evangeline comes from, if you ever read it in high school.
Ended up in Louisiana and became Cajuns. But anyway, the tide began to turn for the British in 1759 when they captured French forts Duquesne, finally, Ticonderoga, and Louisburg. The biggest victory of all came in September.
All great battles to really read about if you're interested in that. I have read a couple books on the French and Indian War. Um, um, the War That Made America is the one that I read, which is actually a short version of Crucible of War. I think I forget who the author is, but PBS also made a documentary about it. But yeah, very, very interesting battles.
When the British trounced the French at the Plains of Abraham near Quebec, Montreal surrendered the next year. The rest of the battles aren't that important unless you were fighting in them, and I'm sure you can count on the French and Indian War aficionados to fill the gaps in comments, but suffice it to
Yeah, my ancestor actually fought in the French and Indian War. They were newly arrived from Ireland. He had come in the 1940s with his father, and they went into the fur trade, as I said before, and they fought in the French and Indian War.
to say that the British were victorious in North America, the Caribbean, Europe, and as far away as India. The war continued officially for 3 more
All over
years
the
and
world.
ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So the most obvious result of the war was territorial changes, particularly in the green areas of not America. And even though Britain won the war, they arguably got the short end of the territorial stick. Under the terms of the Peace of Paris, Britain got Canada from France and Florida from Spain. In return, France got Guadeloupe and Martinique, Caribbean sugar islands that were much more valuable, at least monetarily, than Canada. Sorry, Canada, but if you want to be valuable, grow some sugar. And not sugar beets either, Canada. Real sugar. And Spain got Cuba with its awesome sugar trade, and the Philippines with its proximity to China, which were much more valuable than Florida. I mean, at the time, Florida did not even have Disney World. Instead, it had yellow fever. But the real losers of the war were not the British or the Spanish or the French, but the Native Americans. The shuffling of territories meant the French were out of the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys, and the American Indians were stuck with the British, who kind of sucked. And as the British moved west, Native Americans felt compelled to fight back. Oh, it's time for the mystery document?
Yeah, I don't know if he's going to talk about, I forgot what the war was called. Anyway, yeah, there was an Indian uprising shortly after the war, but that ended up causing the British to come out with the this division line. Man, whew, it's been a while. Anyway, I think it's King George III ends up bringing in a line saying that American settlers cannot cross that line into their territory, things like that. And I can't remember if that led settlers disobeyed that law, moved in, and that led to, is it Pontiac's War? I want to say it's Pontiac's War. Anyway, let's see the mystery document.
The rules here are simple. If I'm wrong about the author of the mystery document, I will be shocked by electricity. If I am right, I will be shocked by my knowledge of 18th century primary sources. Okay, here we go. We humbly conceive that it is contrary to the maxims of good policy and extremely dangerous to our frontiers to suffer any Indians of what tribe soever to live within the inhabited parts of this province while we are engaged in an Indian war, as experience has taught us that they are all perfidious, and their claim to freedom and independence puts it in their power to act as spies, to entertain and give intelligence to our enemies, and to furnish them with provisions and warlike stores. To this fatal intercourse between our pretended friends and open enemies, we must ascribe the greatest of the ravages and murders that have been committed in the course of this and the last Indian war. We therefore pray that this grievance be taken under consideration and remedied. Enough. Usually, you either know it or you don't.
Yeah, I don't know this one. I will say that yeah, there was always, not with every North American tribe, but with some of them there was, just if an Indian tribe was known to have committed atrocities, you know, white settlers were inclined to retaliate, and vice versa. All right, that there was, if a tribe was treated poorly or felt threatened, they would respond, and vice versa. It was always going on.
And I don't. The author is clearly not an Indian. The first person plural makes me think the author is probably not an individual, which makes it harder. Certainly we're getting a taste of the tension between colonists and Native Americans on the frontier. But who is writing about this tension, I have absolutely no idea. Stan, you get to shock me. Who is it? Are you serious? I told you it has to be an individual person! Fine. Gah! So after the end of the 7 Years' War, American Indians organized an armed revolt. In 1763, Indians, particularly from the Ottawa and Delaware tribes, launched what has come to be known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Now, of course, the rebellion ultimately failed to dislodge the British, but the Native Americans did manage to besiege Detroit and kill hundreds of settlers. And that convinced the British that if they wanted to avoid future conflicts, they should slow down the colonist settlements into the territories. So the British Parliament issued the Proclamation Line of 1763, which forbid...
I wanted to see the proclamation line, but I didn't want to sound dumb. I should have sounded dumb, and then I would have looked smart, right? Anyway, let's go.
Settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains and reserved that territory for Indians. Now that sounds like a sensible policy until you remember that the British colonists had just finished fighting a war in order to get the right to move into that very
Yeah,
territory. So the settlers duly ignored the proclamation line and got down to settling. The other big outcome of the 7 Years' War was that it
that was a picture of Daniel Boone, the previous one before this. But crossing into Kentucky, the something gap, Cumberland Gap, I believe it is. If not, correct me in the comment section. But I was gonna say, yeah. So George Washington, the reason why he went was involved in the fighting is because he saw Ohio as a good land, as rich in land, something that he could benefit off, sell, things like that. So when the King of England says, "Up, oh, nope, all that area is now cut off, close to settlers," well, that's going to hurt people like George Washington, who have a stake in that land that had been claimed by Virginia.
it set up the American Revolution. I mean, you've just seen
Mhm.
colonists ignoring the British Parliament. We'll talk more about that next week, but around the end of the 7 Years' War, new ideas like republicanism were taking root in the colonies. Republicanism initially meant supporting a government without a king, but in the colonies it came to mean something broader. Now, they didn't believe that everyone was equal. Republicans believed that only property-owning citizens possessed virtue, which was defined in the 18th century not as being like morally good, but as a willingness to subordinate one's personal interest to the public good. This type of republicanism harkened back to a Roman ideal, only, without Caesar stabbing and togas. Stan, I wish you wouldn't. And a second type of
I mean, if you have property, if you own property, the more likely you are going to always vote in your interest. And you have more of an interest in the government, you are also paying the most taxes. So if you're putting in the most into the government, you should get the most out of government. Um, and sometimes I think today, I'm gonna throw in some politics here. I think today we should have, like, if you pay taxes, if you are contributing to your country in taxes, then you should be able to vote. Um, because today we have a welfare system where a lot of people are getting stuff from welfare, but they're not putting anything into the welfare system. And political parties, both political parties, try to use that as leverage to get people to vote. And basically, that's just called a bribe. If you look at countries, you know, uh, um, some parts of our political system like to point to countries like the Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, things like that, and say, "Oh, well, they have a great welfare system." Um, However, what they don't realize is that the people on in the welfare system are paying the taxes to receive the benefits from it. A lot of people in the U.S. on our welfare system are not. They're just receiving and they're not giving. They're not paying taxes, but receiving benefits. So, yeah, I would be for, at least for, if you are paying taxes, you have the right to vote. And that is still a Republican form. It's not total like property owner, like, okay, you have to own a house in order to do it. But I would be in favor of, you have to at least pay taxes in order to um, vote. I think that would be smart to go back to something like that.
political philosophy grew out of ideas that in the 18th century were called liberalism. For classical liberals, the main task of government was to protect citizens' natural rights, which were defined by John Locke as life, liberty, and property. For liberals like Locke, governments were
So these, I catch these guys all the time. They like to leave God out of the natural rights thing. You can't leave God out of the natural rights idea, because John Locke himself and Charles Montesquieu, who both heavily influenced the founding fathers, both said that natural rights come from God. And there's no way to avoid that, but these people like to avoid it. That's why I like doing these videos, to show things like this. Okay, the Declaration of Independence talks about nature's laws and about the God that governs over those nature's laws. They did not leave God out of it. If you want Enlightenment figures who left God out of everything, you can go to Voltaire, you can go to Rousseau. They definitely left God out of rights that they believed people had. But Locke and Montesquieu and the founding fathers saw that our rights come from God.
were the result of a social contract whereby individuals would give up some of their
See, the social contract idea is not from John Locke. That's either from Rousseau or Voltaire. You cannot conflate the two. And we'll get more into it in the next one. I'll explain a little bit more in depth in the next video because they talk about it too.
their liberty in exchange for a government protecting their natural rights. So republicanism and liberalism were undermining traditional political authority, and so was the Great Awakening, in which Americans
Mhm.
awakened from being very religious to being super religious. The Great Awakening took place in the early decades of the 18th century, and it was a revitalization.
Yeah, there is no doubt that the Great Awakening played a big part in bringing colonials to wanting to become independent and the ideas of liberty and things like that. That was preached heavily from the pulpit by a lot of Great Awakening leaders.
Of religious feeling, energized by revival meetings and the introduction of new denominations. In the early part of the 17th century, most of the English colonists were Anglicans, unless you count the Catholics running Maryland. But by the time of the Great Awakening, there were
Okay, but you also had the Puritans up in New England, and the Congregationalists were pretty big too. So I don't know. I would say that Protestants probably outnumbered Anglicans because, again, Anglicans were a small, it's just the plantation owners. Those are your Anglicans. All right. Their population wasn't that big. The population of Puritans and Protestants was a lot bigger.
also Presbyterians and Baptists and Methodists. Oh my! Even the old line Congregationalist churches were challenged by so-called New Light ministers who placed less of an emphasis on predestination and more on an individual's experience of salvation or being born again. So religion became much more emotional.
Yeah, I lean more to um toward the new light type idea, not predestination. If there's people who are, religious on here, I don't think God has said from time immemorial, all these people will be saved whether they like it or not. No, I believe that in free will, people can choose to accept Christianity. And he says emotional, and I think it becomes emotional because you actually have a personal relationship with Jesus. And when you have that personal relationship with Jesus, the more emotional your religion is going to be.
In the colonies, especially after the arrival of the Englishman George Whitefield, who went on a preaching tour from 1739
Whitfield, but okay.
to 1741. The main thrust of his sermons was that humans need only repent to avoid the horrors of damnation and be saved. And he believed that salvation was within each individual. It's worth noting that this rise in religious fervor was not confined to America or even to Christianity. Like, for instance, Wahhabism, the Islamic reform movement that's still very closely associated with Saudi Arabia, began in the Middle East around the same time. So one of the keys in the American Revolution was a breakdown in respect for authority. And this was fueled partly by economics, partly by political philosophies that undermined faith and governance from afar, and partly by religious revivals that criticized not only church hierarchies, but also other aspects of colonial society. I mean, if people were going so far as to criticize their religious leaders and established religious norms, is it any wonder that they would criticize the acts of a parliament working an ocean away? We'll find out next week. Thanks for watching. Crash Course.
Yeah, and all those things, he is right with that conclusion that all those things, descent created that. And a lot of it is because um, I may have mentioned this in another video, but the colonies were established by religious dissenters for the most part, especially everything from Maryland north. All right, all those places were established by the religious dissenters who weren't going to follow the Church of England, and they said, you know what, we want to establish our own place. And so, for many years, until King George III, they stayed out. England stayed out of the affairs. That's why they set up their own governments, set up their own tax systems, and things of that nature. So, yeah, this was an interesting video. Again, I liked pointing out the different things. If you have disagreements, more information to add, go ahead and add it in the comment section. Please like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you next time.
Produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. The show is written by my high school history teacher, Raul